Alright, I'll do a video on the thermian argument and make everyone angry at me. The thermian argument comes from Galaxy Quest. Remember that funny sci-fi haha show where the Thermians had no concept of fiction? They looked at every work of fiction as a historical document, and thus everything in fiction justifies itself. What is a thermian argument in this context? Well, a thermian argument is usually used to refer to dismissing criticism of a particular work by giving an in-universe reason for whatever is being criticized should be there. The most common thermian argument is historical accuracy. If there's a fantasy game set in fantasy medieval Europe and it gets criticized for not having enough people of color, people will use the thermian argument, well, in that era, in medieval Europe, there weren't a lot of people of color. Which, by the way, is wrong. But yeah, they'll say historical accuracy means we can't have people of color. It makes sense. However, that same game might have magic and goblins and people in chainmail bikinis, and people are okay with that because it's a fantasy and magic is part of fantasy and chainmail bikinis are magical or just how people dress or something like that. Much like the characters in Galaxy Quest, people look at this fictional universe and say, well, it's its own universe, and it deserves to be however it wants to be. But the problem with that is that argument is kind of cyclical. It's kind of saying we can't criticize anything. But we obviously can. If we're comfortable putting magic into a fantasy world, why are we not comfortable putting people of color into a fantasy world? Why does one thing have to be historically accurate and the other thing have to be just a fantasy? Here's another example, Goblin Slayer. That anime does some really problematic shit with women. Like, straight up R-word. You know what I'm talking about, I'm dodging the algorithm. And when that's criticized, people are like, oh, but it makes sense in universe. That's how the goblins act. That's why people are afraid of them. But the choice to show it in such graphic detail was a choice made by a person. And we have had people write evil goblins before without making them do what was done in Goblin Slayer. So even though it makes sense in universe, it only makes sense in universe because the author wrote it to be. And what we're asking is, why did the author choose that? Why, when there's so many other ways to do this, did the author decide to be so exploitative and mortifying toward women? You could say it's because the goblins are evil, but there's other ways to characterize them as evil. You could say it's because that's how goblins reproduce, but someone had to make that decision. Why did they make that decision? So yeah, you can't justify problematic shit just by saying it makes sense in universe. Because someone had to write that universe, and so we have to ask why someone thought writing a universe that way, that was so problematic, was a good idea.